Silicosis, the asbestosis, silicosis, the asbestos of the 21st century. This topic was put to me because it seems like everyone today is saying it is the asbestos of the 21st century. However, silicosis as a disease has been around for a very, very long time. We'll talk a little bit about that, but the next slide is the picture of someone. Okay, the next slide is a picture of someone, a tradie, cutting engineered stone. This has been of practice and of the past, but more often than not, we still see this when we go out and look at work sites. Okay, in this picture, you would see someone cutting with a grinder. There's a whole lot of dust. And if you look around, you would see it's a workshop and dust is everywhere. But what you don't see is the very fine dust that's between 0 to 10 microns. It's so tiny that you can't see it, and that's the dust that goes straight into your nasal passage and all the way into your lungs. Okay. And after silicosis became an issue, people are attempting to have some protective PPE, and here you see a gentleman using a mask, even though this mask is still insufficient to provide him that protection. This is the equivalent of an N95 mask, and these masks are meant to filter up to 3 microns. Okay, but if you go today to a store like Bunnings, you can buy them at $1 each, and I tell you, these are imported, and they are not fit for purpose. More often than not, the very cheap masks do not filter microns up to 3, particles up to 3 microns. In talking about silicosis as being the asbestos of the 21st century, I thought I'd touch a little bit about asbestos as well, very briefly. So asbestos is caused by asbestos fibers, and silicosis is caused by silica particles. Okay? Both substances are crystalline in nature, and hence they're a problem. The very nature of being crystalline means that they sit in the lungs and they tend to affect the surrounding lung tissue, resulting in those tissues being affected, becoming fibrous in nature. And once they become fibrous, they don't have the capacity then to allow for the exchange of gases. Both of them have a latency period in that it could take years for those symptoms to express themselves. And both can be fatal. We'll talk a little bit about that as we move along. Next slide. Some of the similarities and differences. Both conditions are caused by inhalation of tiny particles that attach to the lungs. In asbestosis, they are the asbestos fibers, and in silicosis, they are the silica fibers. And each have a distinctive radiological presentation. You know, this is how they determine whether you have either silicosis or asbestosis, is that in the old days they used to take X-rays, and more recently they take CT scans. Okay. We as a union representing workers have a preference for a CT scan. There are limitations of how often you can take them, but in taking CT scans, it's been shown that there are early diagnosis of these conditions. Okay. The damage from these both products are quite severe. In the case of silicosis, because the nature of those dust particles are so small that they settle at the upper portion of your lungs. And generally in asbestosis, the particles settle to the bottom of the lungs. This is not the rule, but this is generally what the physicians are finding. Okay? And both diseases can progress well after dust exposure is ceased. And we see this very clearly in both asbestosis and silicosis. Both diseases are caused by relatively common job materials. In the early days, working with asbestos was quite a common workplace material, and nowadays, working with silica-related material is quite common. There is no cure when you get this condition. In cases where you've got early detection and you are less affected by silicosis or asbestos, your disease could stabilize. But ultimately, this disease could progress. And for some people, it could lead to untimely death. Silicosis has been recognized as a disease for more than 400 years. In many ways, if you think about it, if you reflect about it, it makes you wonder. Because if you look at the pyramids, they were built 2,500 years BC. So if you look at that in terms of time, they're approximately 4,500 years ago, these pyramids were built. And I would assume that those stone masons would have got silicosis. But it was only 400 years where a person by the name of Georgius Apricola then put together these conditions and said, we think this condition could be classified as silicosis. But, the sad thing and the shocking thing was in Victoria, up to 4 years ago, silicosis was not a reportable disease. Okay. As early as around 2005, 2006, I brought to the attention of WorkSafe several workers who had silicosis. And unfortunately, none of those work sites were visited. So silica, it's so common that it's found in quartz, it's found in sand, it's found in granite, it's found in a whole lot of products, including engineered stone. That is the Caesar stone that many people have in their kitchens. And there are 3 types of silicosis. And the first is called chronic. Chronic is when you have a long-term exposure with relatively small exposure to silica particles. Okay? So it takes a very long time for the condition to express itself. We have many tunnelers and many miners and concrete workers who, after retirement or post-working, tend to have chest conditions. And they would go to their doctors, and the doctors would look at them and say, oh, yes, you have a chest condition. Do you smoke? And in the old days, many of them smoked. And the doctors also, well, it's a result of smoking. They wouldn't do further investigations. So many, many conditions. In fact, the majority of the older workers, that condition was never diagnosed. Okay. You get acute exposure. Acute exposure is when you have exposure to large amounts of silica at any one point in time. You might get a bit of suffocation. You might not express that condition, but you are acutely affected. But in more recent times, there's another classification called accelerated silicosis. This is the one that we are seeing now. This is the one that's often seen where people who work with benchtop, engineered stone, and more so, people in quarrying and in mines. And much of this is due to the fact that we have now modern pieces of equipment, modern tools that have great capacity to spin at very high speeds. Like when they grind the stones, they create a lot of dust. In the old days, the stonemason would take his chisel and knock at the stone, and the tunnelers would work with equipment that didn't generate that amount of dust. And that's why we're getting high rates of accelerated silicosis. In fact, we're getting people who are getting silicosis now, even after 1 or 2 years of being in the job, which was never heard of before. And we are getting very young people. In fact, I think from memory, the most recent one was someone who was 22 years of age. So relatively, entering the workforce after a couple of years. And some of the occupations where people are getting silicosis are the benchtop or the engineered stone, stone masonry, foundry work, mining, quarries, people working with ceramics, tunneling, civil construction. That's what much of our members are working in. Building tombstones. In more recent times, we've identified that our members working in graveyards are drilling and cutting tombstones. Yeah. Concrete batch plants. Next slide. Just to give you an idea of particle size that we are talking about. This is a strand of air, and the normal human air is somewhere between 50 and 70 microns. Okay. On the left, you will see fine beach sand. That's the very fine beach sand that we see at our Golden Beaches. The size is 90 microns. Okay. Then, when you look further up, 10 p.m., that's dust pollen. And often we don't see the pollen when we breathe it. Some of them that suffer from allergies have that. Then, a bit further up on that picture, you get 2.5 p.m. particulate matter, where you find combustion particles like smoke, particles that come out of combustion. Okay? And then when you look at the silica particles that we're talking between 0 and 10 microns, you can now have a perspective of how fine it is, and that is why it's invisible. Okay. And that's why it's so dangerous. Okay. The next slide, just to continue that perspective of how small these particles are. These are electron microscopes, and picture A is, okay, so these are ash samples that were just taken out of volcanic rock. Okay. And at the bottom there, you'll find the size of 2 microns. And if you then compare it to the darkened portion, you'll then have perspective of how tiny 2 microns are. The picture on the right-hand side, picture E, it's 15 microns. And you can see these fibers. From top to bottom, that's 15 microns. And at the bottom picture, it's 2 microns, 0.2 microns, sorry, beg your pardon, 0.2 microns. And you can see that nanofiber stretching from one end to the other being 15.2 microns. Now you can understand how fine these are. Okay. And it is the crystalline structure that causes corrosion to your lung tissues. Unfortunately, many of us don't appreciate how delicate our lung tissues are. We don't understand. It is not brought to our attention. And in many of these workplaces, and Joe will talk about it, is when she worked there, no one told them how dangerous silica was. The employees were aware of that, but they never bothered to tell anyone. Okay. Briefly, after much agitation from the unions, after we really made a case, the new workplace exposure for crystalline silica is 0.5 micrograms per meter cubed. We were asking for 0.25, or actually 0.2, but we had to compromise because initially it was 1 microgram per meter cubed. And the unions, and ably led by the Victorian Trades Hall, we really pushed for it, and we had to settle for 0.05. Okay. And as I said, when the silica particles start corroding your lungs, you get a condition called fibrosis, where the lung tissue gets damaged, it becomes white fibrous tissue, and it doesn't have capacity to allow you to exchange of gases. Okay? And this builds up over time, and this is where the period of latency comes in, is that it takes a lot of time to express itself. Initially, you might have some levels of breathlessness, but as humans, we tend not to pay attention to it, and only when it becomes serious, we are aware that we've got a problem. And often, that's a bit too late. Okay? And one of the other unpleasant accompanying facts or side issues with silicosis is that you develop autoimmune conditions. You have conditions like scleroderma, lupus, rheumatoid arthritis. Even to get those accepted by WorkSafe or WorkCover was such a battle. It had to take years to do that, and finally now they accept it. Scleroderma is a condition where you get tightening of your skin conditions, tightening of bones, and you have all of these difficulties. You can't move. Apart from not being able to breathe, you have all of these other conditions. Okay. And as I said, it's only about 4 years ago that silicosis is a reportable disease. Okay. Curtin University, the AWU commissioned them, and they then, using 2006 exposure levels, estimate that approximately 100,000 workers were exposed to to crystalline silica. And about 10,000 of them will get lung cancer, will get silicosis, which is a type of lung cancer. These are stark figures. These are grim figures. These are quite dark figures. And more recently, Joanna will talk about it, is that they're now talking about 600,000 people who have been exposed. I just want to give you a few press quotations. At the top it says, shiny benchtop comes at too great a price. Sydney Morning Herald and the 60 Minutes suggest some employees are continuing to cut corners and that the compliance to relevant codes is at times forced less than optimally. We attest to that. As a union, we see this every day. We have problems, the regulators are not doing enough. Okay. Investigative journalists Adele Ferguson and Amelia Ballinger reported, documents, photographs, and damning video footage have uncovered a dark underbelly of workplace health and safety, where workers are left behind unprotected by a system that allows companies to put profits before workers are. I can attest to you that this is happening in this day and age. We have large companies that put profit before their workers. They are not prepared to stop. The regulations, the silica regulations, say that if you are not in compliance with the regulations, you should stop work, fix the problem, and continue production. Do you think they do that? No, they just do not do that. We are struggling to get the regulators to enforce that regulation. I'm sad to tell you that. And, and this is another quote. Last slide. You can see more than a couple of feet in front of you for the dust, he said. It is in your clothes, it is in your skin, it is in your eyes, it's in your car. You take it home with you. It's just everywhere. And unfortunately, he was given a life expectancy of 5 to 10 years. So these are some of the difficulties that our workers face. And it is taking a very long time for employers and regulators to understand the difficulties that we face. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Joanna McNeill. So I worked in a quarry. I'll just give you a little bit of a background of my story. I worked in a quarry. I worked in admin, 90 metres roughly from the crushing plant. I did walk around the quarry generally every single day, but mainly in the portable office there. So that was back in 2013 I started. I worked in safety a lot. I helped implement lean in the workplace. I did all the safety meetings. I did the minutes for the safety meetings. I would talk in toolbox about safety. I did a lot actually in safety. How did I not know about what crystalline silica dust was? I still don't know how I did not know about it. Didn't even know it existed, didn't know it was in the dust, had no idea. Which is really disappointing because now I have silicosis. I went on to maternity leave and came back in 2019 roughly. So I was working at the quarry for a couple of years, like 4 years, and came back from maternity leave, and they saw something on my lungs. And I was like, I have no idea what that is. So I had lots of tests to the point after a year I had a lung biopsy, which is absolutely horrific. First of all, I'd like to say that my insurance company declined my claim first, until then had my lung biopsy, and then it was confirmed that I had silicosis. I had a 6-month-old baby at the time, so you can imagine it's been really, really hard getting that diagnosis, especially when I get a phone call after my biopsy to say, hey Joe, guess what, you don't have lung cancer. And I was like, I had no idea that's what you were testing for. So definitely been quite a struggle with that. You know, during this whole time, I'm now a single mum of 2. Talk about mental health, I can't even talk about it because it's next level. I just can't even open that. Talking about insurance companies, to get to anything, I will tell you, I was earning, as a single mum, $520 a week, because when I came back from maternity leave, they put my claim as part-time, even though when I got diagnosed, or when I was sick and contracted silicosis, I was on full-time. But so I'd been for the last few years earning $520. And I cannot get help from Centrelink, because if I did, that's classified as an income. So I don't know how single mums do it. I really don't. I don't know how I've been doing it. They have not been helpful at all. And, you know, you talk about your mental health. I am going through a lot, and constantly having to fight with these insurance companies. I'm actually just exhausted. And I've got to keep going because I have 2 little girls, which is really difficult. You know, I've been in and out of hospital. I'm still waiting to get reimbursed, and I was in hospital, I think it was November last year. I still have not been reimbursed. You know, I got pneumonia, which then set off an autoimmune, which then gave me chronic arthritis, and the pain was horrific. I'd rather give childbirth 1,000 times over to the pain that I was in. I'm constantly going to doctors. I am actually really grateful that Percy and at the AWU, Australia's Workers Union, offered me a job. I haven't worked in a long time, and they know obviously my issues. And, you know, they've been very flexible. I can go do all my doctor's appointments. I can be there for my children. If I'm sick, they know my story, and I'm really grateful that I've had the union to support me and back me. It's been, fantastic. I want to read out a statistic. Percy, you kind of put me on the spot, and I didn't have my statistics here. That's why I ran off. So I just want to say it is an estimate up to 600,000 Australian workers are potentially being exposed to silica dust each year across the wide range of industries. To me, this is crazy. Absolutely crazy. We need to stop this, and we need to I come out and talk about the silica and what it's done to me and stuff, but this is crazy. This is going to kill hundreds of thousands of people. In saying that, I would like to mention that, the Australian Workers Unions have a dust registry for anyone that's in the quarrying, tunnelling, cutting, anything, that there is a registry, because maybe you might not have it now, but you might get it in 10 years, you might get it in 20 years. But if we can just get people registered, it will help, help fight this battle. Thank you.
All right, we have a question.
So just imagine that we win and we change work practices here. It's just going to be offshored, and I'm just really concerned, how are we going to prevent this being something like we have exported other problems? Has you started work on that?
we have to make this a public issue. We would have to get public support. It's only when we get community involvement and support that the people who have the capacity to change will change it. As unions, we are trying our very best, but we are facing brick walls. Every time we go, we're struggling. In Joanna's case, recently, the company was prosecuted. The company was Boral. They listened to all of that, and the judge was outraged by the conditions how the company had treated Joanna. In fact, the company objected to Joanna reading an impact statement in court. The judge wanted it, and the court objected, and the judge was outraged by Boral saying it has no material impact. True, it had no material impact, but the judge said Joanna has the right to tell a story. In spite of the outrage, the judge only fined them $180,000. For a company like Boral, they would make that money in 2 or 3 minutes. What is the incentive for that company to change? Do you have any thoughts?
I'll just also say that is true, but as with asbestos, we've continued to work with our comrades overseas around making sure that whatever we do, that asbestos is eradicated internationally. And so we work with campaigns internationally in those countries where, if you think the fear is that if we ban a product, the first thing I'd say is there are alternatives to the kind of manufactured stone that gets used that are safe. So the first thing is, by getting rid of certain kinds of manufactured stone, we don't product can still be made. It's just a different product that gets used. So it's not like we are just saying, well, this is the thing we need. If we don't do it here, we'll just we'll outsource the problem to another country where workers will die. In this case, we can just go to different products that don't cause that harm. So that's really what we're campaigning for, is to get rid of entirely the use of the kinds of manufactured stone that hurts workers and shift to manufactured stone that doesn't. And that's a relatively easy ask, I reckon. So that's the primary thing, right? So we're not going to export our problem overseas because we can just use a different product. That's the vibe, because I get the risk, right? Because that's what we did with asbestos. Are there any other questions? Yes.
Usually in America, you use the fracking for extraction of the petrol. The fracking is liberation, broken the stone, and the liberation of the silicato. Silicato is silicon.
Yep, silica.
Silicosis.
Yes.
Now in the metro and here, people are using the proper mask.
The mask.
So this one, because the humidity is broken the stone.
So I think do you have a... So the issue is that, yes, there's silica in a lot of different products, a lot of different things.
Usually because this one normally is the white mineral. The white mineral is a stone. Because they come from Chile. In Chile, I started this one 75. Now, in Australia, when I live in 30 years, 5 years, maybe 10 years, they're talking about what happened to silicosis.
Yep.
Right.
So
So apart from air and water, the next most common substance is sand or silica. So silica is in almost every other particle. Okay, so it's quite common. So obviously in mining, fracking, would be somewhat related to, digging in the ground and looking for the gases. And sure, those people would be exposed. They'd be raising dust. Well, fortunately, most of the states, except Northern Territory, I think, have allowed fracking. There is some form of fracking in this country, but it's limited to those areas, and I'm sure there must be some controls in place that would be better than some of the third world countries.
I think Percy's right. I think silica's in a lot of things. I don't know that silica in the form that causes silica. Part of the issue is when you work with manufactured stone, it's the level of constant exposure. As you know, it's this thing where it's not, if you get it, unlike asbestosis, where you get one particle and that can cause...
You know about this one, the mineral, it's about the protection.
Yes.
This is the first time. You know, it's on the protection. This is usually the good quality mask for prevention.
The masks...
Ventilation.
Yeah. So in most of the industries we have here, where there is a high percentage of silica, there's an expectation that you have a proper fit test of mass, and you tend to use positive pressure mask.
Yep.
So then there's less chance of any of the dust particles of silica entering into your breathing space.
I think the issue with the manufactured stone is that they have found that the measures to reduce it are insufficient, even if they water it down, even with masks, even with proper ventilation. It just doesn't, it's not enough, which is why we're going for a total ban, as opposed to other places where there is, you might be exposed to silica, but you might be outside, so there's better ventilation, or you're given a mask or whatever. So there are some forms of silica where the handling and the measures to reduce the risk have been found to work, and there are other ways where it doesn't.
Because this is the job more safe. You know this one? Because this regulation isn't about this one. It's safe.
Yeah.
I mean, it's good we have regulations, but unfortunately not everyone wants to follow the regulations.
Yeah, that's always the risk as well. All right, let us thank our presenters, our last presenters for the day.